hi everybody. I guess I want to give you a little preface to say this is going to be one of these sort of more ambitious kind of talks. The basic question I want to try and answer is what innovators should try to be doing over, let's say, the next 3,000 years or so. And I was talking to Nathan before, and he said, 3,000, what about 2,500? And I said, well, that would be completely different. Prepare something completely different. So my basic answer is going to be something along the lines of we're going to spend a lot more attention on problems of surplus as opposed to problems of scarcity. And that may not make sense right now, but hopefully in the end of 15 minutes or maybe 20, you'll understand what I'm talking about. So let me first start with the question, a lot of innovators in the room, I'm sure, of just what exactly innovation is. Innovation is this thing in our times which people like. In America, it's seen as this kind of almost sacred writ. We want to innovate. Everyone wants to work for an innovative company. No one wants to work for a backward company. So the question is, what is innovation? And I was sitting in earlier this week in a taxi and trying to think about this question. What distinguishes innovation from just change or inventions, things like that? I was sitting there and I thought, well, we invented traffic jams, century. We invented freezer burn. These aren't quite innovative. They're changes, they're new things, but they're not quite what we have in mind when we think of innovations. And then, there's these little, most of you from New York, there's these little TVs that go on and start playing whatever. And I thought, now this is really not an innovation. And the reason is, it's sort of, they thought it was an innovation, but it's not an innovation. And the reason is like, I didn't really have a problem that was being solved when you think about it. I was perfectly happy sitting in my taxi, maybe thinking about what I'm going to do next. And, next thing you know, on comes whatever those little messages are. And so, to make a long story short, I think we have to understand innovation, if we're trying to understand what's going to happen in the next 3,000 years, as efforts to change things to solve human problems. Addressing human needs. Seems pretty straightforward, but it distinguishes change from innovation. And so the question becomes then, if you're thinking about, well, what should innovators be doing over the next 3,000 years? The question is, what are the problems? And what I want to suggest is that for the last 3,000 or so years, we have fundamentally been dealing with the problem of scarcity, the problem of not enough. It's a very natural problem. It's almost hard to think of it as not a problem. That's what I think is going to be the challenge. When you imagine someone 500 years ago, 100 years ago, the basic problems they faced were not having enough of what they needed or wanted. Not enough food, not enough stuff, not enough information, not enough entertainment. I would submit to you that the average person for most of human history has been hungry, bored, and hasn't had enough stuff, hasn't had as much stuff they need just to have their life run. And we've basically, in the innovative industries, technologists, for the last 3,000 years, and when I mean technologists, I include like the caveman who's sort of making a flint thing, or whoever invented fire, or whatever they do, mostly they've been working on these three problems. Not enough. And so when you think about food, for example, in addition to agriculture, move forward, you've had the Green Revolution. We've had an enormous amount of technological innovative effort to try to make it possible that we have a solution to this most basic of sort of biological problems, which is being hungry, not having enough to eat, starving to death. When you go out into anywhere, it's so biological. Animals, what is the thing that animals react to? Food is just everything. And, we've been going at that for about 3,000 years, and we've started to get to the point where we have enough food. Not only at this particular event. In general, we started to have, as a civilization, as a species, we have enough food. What about, not enough stuff, material possessions, houses, things like that? Well, this kind of depends on what country you live in, but if you live in advanced societies, we have these amazing industries which have generated almost all the stuff that anyone could possibly need. What you want might be a different story, but basically the basic needs have been met. Very few people die because they don't have, in rich countries, die because they don't have clothes or don't have shelter. There's some, but generally speaking, it's the problem which we have begun to overcome. And the third big problem is the problem of not having enough information. Or entertainment, the problem of being bored, which leads to a certain kind of suffering. It does. It may seem like a small thing, but I can remember when I was a child that the idea of cable television, of actually having cable television, I guess either my parents didn't believe in it or we couldn't afford it, I don't know what it was, but we did not have cable. I imagine this was going to be the day we got cable, that there would be no suffering from that point forward. That my life would be, just a different kind of life. That would be sort of a transcendence of all the problems there could possibly be. Can you imagine? I had so much joy already from the 3 channels. Can you imagine having 30 channels or something? I just couldn't, the thought of it was too much. So, the idea of being entertained whenever we want and with luscious, interesting entertainment is so unbelievable to generations and generations of people who have been fundamentally bored with life. And you get this if you read. I've done a lot of research into old periodicals, and you read about, let's say, farmers or so forth in the 19th century. They complain a lot just about being bored. Anything will entertain them. When you watch silent films from the early in the 20th century, you think this isn't really that. Some of them are good, but some of them aren't that captivating. But you realize if you're dealing with people who are just in the state of fundamental boredom, that even the smallest amount of entertainment can be entertaining. But as everyone I think knows in this room, we have reached a completely different state with entertainment. 200 channels is no longer a blessing; it is a curse. Almost everyone, I imagine, in this room feels that they are just overflowing with information, that their day involves too much coming at them, that they have the exact opposite problem. And what I'm trying to suggest in all these areas, to sort of put this together, is that we have started as a civilization to finally move beyond the fundamental biological problem of scarcity and instead flip into problems of surplus, problems of too much, problems of overload. And what I'm suggesting is that the innovators of the next 3,000 years will need to deal with these and other types of problems. That the kind of problems we're facing as a civilization are going to fundamentally change. In other words, you might say that I'm suggesting that the innovators of today need to start thinking about what are the challenges of a post-scarcity society or a post-scarcity civilization. Now, I want to identify 3 areas where I think the innovators of the next 3,000 years will, or let's just say the next 100, keep it a little simpler, will have their work put out for them. So the first category is continuing to solve the existing problems of scarcity. For me to say that we have all the food we want at this particular dinner, although I haven't quite served it yet, but to say that we have all the food we want is not to say that everyone in the world has all the food they want. And there are obviously areas in the world where people still don't have enough, still areas within this country where people still don't have enough. So in some ways, the scarcity project is not completely done. My diagnosis is a little bit premature. There's also the related challenge of trying to solve the scarcity problem, trying to achieve abundance in a way that is sustainable, that can keep going for 3,000 years and not put all of us in search of another planet. So these are versions of the scarcity problem that need to be solved as we go along. The second area where, and I think slightly more transformative area, or the area that requires different thinking, is starting to try and tackle the problems of surplus. I think as a species, as a civilization, we do not handle surplus problems very well. If someone, for example, doesn't have enough food, doesn't have shelter, it's a very sort of sympathetic problem. We think we need to go out and help this problem. If someone suffers from a problem of having accumulated too much stuff, eating too much food, we say that person is a fat hoarder. We have this, that's a little harsh, but we have a very personal view of how we view surplus problems. We don't see them as problems that are civilization or social problems. Well, we do a little, but what we see them as problems of personal willpower, lack of self-control. And so what I'm suggesting is that what we'll need to do is develop the capacity to understand problems of surplus and start to handle them, even though they're the problems we created ourselves. Humans are strange creatures. We spend thousands of years trying to solve problems, and then we have to spend thousands of years trying to fix the problems that were created by trying to solve the problems. So that's the way we are. And that looks like I lost our one-on-one. What I'm trying to say is that in overcoming scarcity, we've started to create these enormous surplus problems, and we're going to have to try to start to solve them. And they will require us to think of them as social, as civilization problems. The third category of problems I think that we're going to have to solve are the problems of trying to understand what types of surplus really matter to us and what types of scarcity really matter to us. So let me explain what I mean by that. Most people I know in rich countries and in cities like this one would probably report that their material conditions, that is, their basic material wants, are in surplus. They have enough food, they have enough to drink, they have enough possessions. But when you ask them what is scarce, it is much more the psychic or the psychological conditions that are scarce. For example, people complain about not having enough time. They don't have enough attention. These are the scarcities of our era. If you ask someone what they don't have, and it's often, and when you think about it, what is scarce that becomes the currency of an age, it is these things like time and attention that are what are scarce. And so another line, and what innovators can think they need to help people with, as tough as it may be, is to give them what they need, which is scarce, which is to find ways, in other words, to give people a way back to owning their own attention and owning their own time. In other words, in some ways, the third project is a project of liberation, of somehow trying to give people back the ownership they once very naturally had over their time and attention. So that is the agenda for the next 3,000 years. I won't be around to finish it out, but I'm very happy to be here and have this opportunity to present these ideas. Thank you very much.